Welcome to Mr. A's History class. Today we're going to talk about protesting the Vietnam War, the anti-war movement. A lot of cool stuff to cover today, so we're going to jump right on in. One of the most notable symbols of the anti-war movement was the peace symbol, developed in 1958 by Gerald Holtham, a man from Britain. It is actually the letters for nuclear disarmament, ND, in semaphore. The N is an upside-down V, and the D is two flags, one up, one down. When you superimpose those, you get the notable peace symbol, the straight line with the upside-down V in the bottom. Another key addition to the early anti-war movement was the formation of SDS. SDS stands for the Students for Democratic Society, founded in 1959. Quickly became one of the most important and most influential anti-war organizations with groups in nearly every college campus. SDS was able to mobilize lots of different college-age groups to protest the Vietnam War. Resistance to the war before the Tonkin Gulf resolutions was largely limited to people who were already pacifist in nature. These are people who were protesting war for war's sake. They were not specifically targeting the Vietnam War. However, following the passage of the Tonkin Gulf resolutions, you have those who are joining the anti-war movement who are resisting the draft, or who are angry at the large numbers of civilian deaths, or who don't believe the American view that they are there to fight against the communists. They believe that they are there to with some kind of imperialist agenda, the idea that they are going to try to carve out some kind of empire out of Southeast Asia. And then there are those that are adversely affected by the negative media coverage, especially the coverage following the Tet Offensive. Some of the early colleges to join the anti-war movement, University of Michigan was the first one to have what they call teach-ins, which is basically a large seminar where classes were canceled, where they had rallies, speeches, and it was open to anyone who was there to speak out. And it had no time limit, and the first one lasted well into the night and was largely successful. It was followed by up to 38 other universities who did something very similar. By 1965, after the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, you have SDS beginning to form lots of resisting the draft organizations. Basically, young draft individuals, people who were drafted, were burning their draft cards, were fleeing to Canada, and they called those people draft dodgers, people who fled to Canada and other countries to escape the draft. Another form of protest, taking their example from the Buddhist monk who set himself on fire to protest Diem's policies in South Vietnam, some American anti-war protesters sacrificed themselves through self-immolation. The first one was Alice Hertz in 1965. She was an 82-year-old pacifist who burnt herself to death in Detroit. She was seen by a passing motorist and had the flames put out, but she died 10 days later. Sadly, there would be a total of 9 other Americans who would protest the Vietnam War in similar ways. Other people who protest the war early on were some of the veterans from Korea, veterans from World Wars I and World War II, and those who had already served in Vietnam. Some of them joined together to protest the Vietnam War. A very powerful and very meaningful protest. Although still early in the war movement, it was a significant step forward. The public anti-war sentiment slowly deteriorated. It started pretty high, about 70% early on, but as it became clear that Johnson was not campaigning, he had early campaigned in 1964 as a peace candidate, but as it came more and more clear that he was not a peace candidate, but that he was escalating the war, moving the war from a few 100,000 to over 500,000 troops, it is quite clear that Americans begin to see the war as the most important national issue and to see it very negatively. Another big moment is when 1967, when Martin Luther King begins to speak out against the war. He makes it very clear that he sees the war as a connection between poverty and the class issue, and he tries to get the civil rights protesters and the anti-war protesters to join forces. In 1967, you also see protests on the University of Michigan over Dow Chemicals. Dow Chemicals was asked to not be allowed on campus by the students because they are one of the largest producers of napalm.
Napalm, son! Nothing else in the world smells like that! I love the smell of napalm in the morning. You know, one time we had a hail bomb? For 12 hours, when it was all over, I walked up. We didn't find one of them, not one stinking dink body. Smell! You know that gasoline smell? The whole hill. Smells like victory.
What a great line. It may have smelled like victory to Lieutenant Colonel Kilgore, but it did not smell like victory to the students at University of Wisconsin, who in their protest suffered 65 students with injuries along with 3 police officers, but they were successful in keeping Dow Chemicals banned from the college campus. As we move forward into the 1960s, we see a growing discussion about the gaps. First is the credibility gap of Lyndon Baines Johnson, who campaigned as a peace candidate in 1964, but by 1968 in the Tet Offensive, it is widely clear that he is not a peace candidate. He has escalated the war and is not doing a good job of running that war. So there is an incredible lack of credibility that he suffers from, which is one of the key reasons why he ends up not running for president in 1968. There's also the communications gap, which is the gap between the Hawks and the Doves. The Hawks being for the war, the Doves being against the war. The Hawks thinking that the Doves are nothing more than a bunch of liberal commies who are clueless at best or absolutely hate America at the worst, and the Doves who see the Hawks as baby killers and warmongers who have no idea what is in the best interest of the United States. Finally, we have the discussion about the generation gap. This is the gap between the generations of the baby boomers, who were born after World War II, and the generation that had fought in World War II. The generation that had fought in World War II assumed it was America's duty to fight when America's government calls you to war, regardless of whether you believe in that war or not. I mean, they did their job in World War II. They fought. You know, they didn't complain. Of course, there was a moral cause that was the World War II was being fought for. Vietnam, in the eyes of many of the younger generation, lacked a moral cause. The reason given by the American government to stop the spread of communism was a very thin reason for many of them. And in fact, many of them believed it was a lie, an absolute lie, as more and more coverage came out and it became apparent that the Americans were not being told the entirety of what's going on. This leads to a very powerful reaction between the two generations. We have what's called the counterculture that develops, a culture that is contrary and counter to the main or dominant culture, a youth culture. The word teenager, of course, first enters the lexicon in the 1950s, but in the 1960s, it really receives its heyday. And you have the younger generation rejecting social norms by embracing sex, drugs, and rock and roll. These were called hippies. They were called flower children. This group of people was the key in the New Left that we'll talk about later on. They also basically they changed the way America saw a lot of its society. One of the most powerful expressions of the counterculture movement was the Woodstock Music Festival in August of 1969. For 3 days in upstate New York, nearly 500,000 people, between 300,000 and 500,000 people, they descend upon a small dairy farm in upstate New York, about 600 acres. There is no parking space, so they park for miles up and down this small 2-lane road. There is no way to keep the music festivals out because of a change of venue. The concert promoters had to decide whether to build a stage or whether to build a fence around the grounds, and so they said, well, if we don't have a stage, there's no point in having the concert. So they basically had to put on the music festival for free, which meant they basically lost their shirt on this. But that was part of the brilliance and part of the beauty of the music festival. For 3 days, you had, a city the size of modern day Cincinnati descend upon 600 acres and engage in concerts and all kinds of other expositions of the counterculture. And not a single violent crime happened. There was a lot of people tripping out on drugs, but there were not any major violent crimes. I mean, the worst things we had were broken bones, like a couple babies were delivered, things like probably a lot of babies were conceived. But there was a lot of beauty in the Woodstock Music Festival, let alone some of the most awesome music and acts that will ever happen at any given time. However successful Woodstock was, the anti-war movement would inevitably lead to a reactionary anti-war movement as the hawks and the doves struggle over the soul of America. Is America going to be the kind of country that supports the Vietnam War or does not support the Vietnam War? For those who were part of the Hawks, those who supported the war, it was about doing your job as an American citizen. This is what an American citizen does. When America's country calls for war, my country, right or wrong, I go and serve. And so to dodge responsibility, to be a draft dodger, to burn your draft card, to protest, a lot of the people in Middle America, a lot of the people that supported the war, saw these people as spoiled, privileged, rich kids going to school on daddy and mommy's money and then thumbing their nose at society, and it just burnt them up. They were so angry. Nixon tapped into this rage, called this group the silent majority, and rode that kind of angst and frustration into the White House. It also did not help the cause, the anti-war cause, when other organizations grew increasingly radical. SDS became increasingly radical, of course, as it moves on through the 60s, and even in 1969, you have a splinter group from SDS, the Weathermen, or the Weather Underground Organization, that splits off and basically declares war on the United States government. They basically start a bombing campaign. Unfortunately for them, the only people who are killed by their bombs are their own people. There are three members of SD or the Weather Underground that are killed when a bomb of theirs goes off accidentally in Greenwich Village in New York City. But they are very successful in attacking key government institutions, most namely the Senate building and the Pentagon. However, they are other anti-war groups distance themselves from them, and it does not do anything to win supporters over. They are raging against the machine, so to speak. They're not doing anything significant. They are basically hurting their own cause. Impacts of the anti-war movement are enormous. You have an unprecedented reaction and rejection of the United States government's authority. It continues to have a profound impact to this day. I mean, basically, the Vietnam War and, of course, Watergate, which we will discuss in length on the next unit, basically are 1-2 punch against the credibility of the United States government. And from that point on, up until today, there is a huge reaction against trusting the government in anything it says and does. Ironically, the anti-war movement and the anti-anti-war movement, they expose class tensions that exist within the United States. It was the relatively well-to-do youth of America that protested the Vietnam War, but it was also those that were least likely to be drafted from its ranks into the war. The people who spent the most time suffering through the war were the lower class, the immigrant class, the minorities. Those were the people that had the least ability to get a education deferment. You could basically go to college for 4 years and be exempted from the draft. They were also the least likely to be able to get medical deferments. I mean, for instance, our own president got a medical deferment from the Vietnam War because of bone spurs. Any most of the middle class Americans, most of the well-to-do Americans that were able to go to college at this time, they were the ones that were able to avoid obligation of fighting the war. The others, those who weren't able to go to college, those who were from the lower class, basically had to fight the war and had no real options out of it. And so, in this respect, the war was in many ways a working class war fought by those who, from the poorer, less educated backgrounds. Things start picking up steam beginning in 1969. Nixon's under pressure to remove troops from Vietnam, and so he begins to try to reduce the number of troops from Vietnam after other negotiations fail. However, he wants to make sure that the South Vietnamese forces have a fighting chance, so to speak, as he pulls people out. So he orders secret bombing of Cambodia and Laos. Basically, the Ho Chi Minh Trail goes up and down the border of Vietnam, just across the border in the countries of Laos and Cambodia. So the North Vietnamese have been using another country's borders to move men and material from the north into the south this entire war. We've known it, the North Vietnamese know we know about it, but since it's in another country, the United States has been very hesitant to try to involve another country in the Vietnam War. However, Nixon, pulls no punches, starts bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail. He's basically bombing a foreign country, a neutral country not involved in the war. When it comes out, America loses its mind. A lot of America loses its mind. This is exacerbated when on April 30th, Nixon goes on television to say that he is actually invading Cambodia. He is sending American troops into Cambodia. It is because of that invasion of Cambodia that one of the darkest moments of the anti-war movement happens on the campus of Kent State, Ohio, beginning the weekend of May 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and finally on Monday, May 4th, 1970. What happens on Kent State begins on Friday, May 1st, after the campus lets out students from the classes that day. They gather together at bars and other places, and they begin to form a impromptu protest or rally in the streets there off the campus of Kent State. Twice while the rally was in progress, police cruisers were hit with their beer bottles. Many of the crowd chanted anti-war slogans, and a bonfire was set in the streets. Crowds blocked traffic for about an hour, and finally, the mayor had to come down, read him the riot act, and try to disperse the crowd. Before that, though, there were a lot of quote-unquote political targets that were attacked off the campus. That included banks, loan companies, and other utility companies. In some respects, it could easily be painted as a bunch of drunken students that are basically causing a bunch of problems. But it's not without some provocation. I mean, the students were upset about the announcement of the invasion of Cambodia. If you are a student who's anti-war, you're seeing this as just another provocation from a right-wing president who's basically just lying, saying one thing and lying about it, and doing the exact opposite, saying I want peace, yet while you're trying to basically expand the war by invading Laos and Cambodia. The crowd was dispersed later that night, and things went off pretty well. On the next day, May 2nd, there was a ROTC building on the campus. It was an old army barracks that was slated to be demolished, and it was set on fire in a protest. The firefighters come, and they are resisted by the students. The hoses are slashed.
firefighters leave. The fire basically goes out because the building, well, they don't do a good job of lighting the fire, I guess. And they light the fire again. The police and the firemen come this time. The police disperse the students. The firemen put out the fire, but there's quite a lot of damage that is happening. Sunday is largely quiet. However, there is an anti-war protest that is scheduled for noon on Monday, May 4th. The governor of Ohio hears about it and sends in the National Guard, requested probably by the mayor of the town. On May 4th, as classes are returning, you have this demonstration that is beginning to happen. And you have students who are involved in it and students who aren't. Some students are there who are just walking back and forth to campus and who are caught up in this mayhem. The National Guard show up and they attempt to disperse it. They end up firing tear gas at the protesters, but because of the wind, there is not a lot that is, it doesn't do a good job of dispersing the students. Students get bolder. They start yelling slogans such as pigs off campus at the soldiers. And they even threw some of the canisters of tear gas back at the soldiers. Finally, you have 77 Guard members who basically advance on the soldiers with armed rifles and bayonets. And it is confusing about what happens, but some of the soldiers, 29 of them, reportedly fear for their life, and so they start shooting into the students with live ammunition. Others follow suit, thinking there's something afoot, and altogether, you have 67 shots fired. Gunfire basically lasted 13 seconds, which does not sound for a long time, but count for yourself. 1001, 1002, 1003, 1004, 1005, 1006, 1007, 1008, 1009, 1010, 1011, 1012, 1013. It is a long time to have that gunfire under that amount of time. In the end, 2 of the students who were shot and killed had nothing to do with the protests at all. They were merely traveling in between classes. 9 other students lay wounded. 4 students were dead. And that's why the song Ohio by Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young is basically 4 Dead in Ohio. It's about the 4 students who were killed in this protest, and about the response of Nixon and the governor and all of the people involved. The impact of Kent State was tremendous, and it was immediate. Warning sirens were basically being broadcast all over the United States, not literally, but socially. As the Congress and the American media moved fast to make sure that something like this would not happen again. One thing that Congress did was immediately repeal the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and basically that hamstrung the president. From this point on, the president could not do anything without making sure it was approved by Congress first. This also led to an incredible amount of anger and rage, misplaced rage at the military. The Congressional Court-Martial of Lieutenant Calley, the lieutenant from the My Lai Massacre of 1968 fame, was broadcast and happened at that time. A series of congressional hearings took place the same year where soldiers confessed to other war crimes. And so these court-martials and these hearings basically caused a lot of Americans to be very angry at the military. And so you have a lot of misplaced rage happening at the military. Sure, there are people that are guilty, obviously, but there are a lot of people who are basically keeping their head down, keeping their nose clean and doing their job over there, and did not involve themselves in any kind of immoral activity. However, you get reports of some Americans denouncing men in uniform as baby killers and spitting on soldiers as they come back. It's one of the darkest aspects of America's handling of its military. Furthermore, you have celebrities like Jane Fonda, who made a very notorious trip to Hanoi, where she basically denounced the United States military and its actions, condemning U.S. soldiers as war criminals, the whole lot. This infamous incident incensed many Americans, even anti-war Americans. They believed that she had taken it way too far. You see here in a picture where she is basically on an anti-aircraft gun. Yes, these are the guns that actually shoot down American planes. Here later you see her with applauding an anti-aircraft gun crew, a North Vietnamese anti-aircraft gun crew, basically applauding them, saying, hey, you're doing a good job. You are shooting down Americans, but hey, kudos to you. As during this visit, she also visited American prisoners of war, POWs, and brought back messages from them. When these people came home and started talking about being tortured and being brainwashed and being harmed by the North Vietnamese, she basically called these POWs hypocrites and liars. She basically said as much in the New York Times in 1973, saying, quote, I'm quite sure that there were incidents of torture, but the pilots who were saying it was policy of the Vietnamese and that it was systematic, I believe that's a lie. That being said, there are individuals like Senator John McCain, who was an Air Force pilot who later became senator for Arizona, came home with injuries so severe that he could never raise his arms above his shoulders from that point on. He had been suspended, hanging with his arms behind his back for so long, it caused severe damage in the shoulders. One of the good things that did come out of the Vietnam War was the passing of the 26th Amendment in 1971. It is the amendment that allows 18-year-olds to vote. Basically, 18-year-olds was prior to this time, 18 years old was old enough for you to go to war and be drafted for war, but it wasn't old enough for you to drink, and it wasn't old enough for you to vote on the politicians that were sending you to war. This argument was made very clear in one of the most famous protest songs of the Vietnam War, 1965's Eve of Destruction by Barry McGuire, where he says,
You're old enough to kill, but not for voting. You don't believe in war.
You're old enough to kill, but not for voting. A very strong argument for lowering the voting age. And so the 26th Amendment was passed in 1971. This brings us to the end of our Protesting the Vietnam War. I hope you've had a great time. Hope you've learned a lot, and I hope you are being safe and practicing social distancing on your coronavirus-inspired break. Have a great day.
Understand what I'm trying to say, and can't you feel the fears that I'm feeling today? If the button is pushed, there's no running away. There'll be no one to save with the world in a gray. Take a look around you, boy. It's bound to scare you, boy. And you tell me over and over and over again, my friend, how you don't believe we're on the eve of destruction.